We all know that Kamala Harris lost the 2024 election, but in the aftermath, there has been shockingly little effort by the Democrats to find out why she lost. Post-election reviews are nothing new in American politics. In fact, the modern autopsy, if you will, in the form we know it today, was actually born after the 2012 election when Mitt Romney lost to Barack Obama by nearly 5 million votes. And the Republican Party did a little soul searching. They commissioned what they called the Growth and Opportunity Project. What it found: Mitt Romney underperformed with many groups, including Latino, female, and young voters. Now, fast forward to 2024, the vice president at the time, Kamala Harris, loses to Trump. But not only did she lose, key groups drifted away from the Democratic Party. Again, Latino, female, and young voters. So Democrats, rightfully so, wanted some answers. What did the party get wrong? What did the campaign miss? Democratic National Committee Chair Ken Martin promised to make the report public until he changed his mind because apparently it wouldn't help Democrats win in 2028.
You criticized the DNC's refusal to release their 2016 autopsy as exactly what not to do. You said, quote, "Was there any utility in doing that?" And then promised your 2024 autopsy would be different. Your exact quote was, "Of course it will be released." Why did you change your mind on that?
Well, look, I mean, what I said all along, even when I ran for this position, is that we were going to focus on the things that will help us win the upcoming election.
But now, one of the few Harris campaign officials the DNC's autopsy team actually interviewed is doing what the party has not. He is making his diagnosis of what went wrong public. Rob Flaherty, the Harris campaign's deputy campaign manager, writes in The Bulwark that Democrats had tactics, ads, creators, social media, and viral moments. What they did not have, he argues, was a brand. And Rob Flaherty joins us now. Rob, it's good to have you on the show. In your piece, you say that you haven't seen the autopsy report. There's some questions as to whether it actually ever was put together in a report sense. But you spoke to the team putting together this assessment in October of 2025. What can you tell us about the types of questions they asked you and whether or not you got a sense that they were heading in a certain direction based on the questions they were asking?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. I spoke with the autopsy in late October of 2025. You know, they had said the autopsy would come out shortly after the election. And it was a, 2-hour long conversation. The questions were solid. They were serious. But, my concern was they were not really diving into a lot of the deeper questions about tactics and strategy and the lessons that we could learn from last time. So I started writing, what I actually think we ought to do and what we ought to think about. And that led to the piece that came out earlier this week. But, it was a relatively surface conversation, but it, was focused on a lot of the questions people were asking at the time.
Did you get the sense that they were casting a wide net? I mean, in addition to just the questions that they asked you, the issues they were interested in, did they make a real effort to talk to people sort of up and down the chain in the operation?
It's hard for me to know. I know that they did not speak to that many people from the campaign or the super PAC side. They spoke to a lot of people in the ecosystem, is my understanding. But, as far as I can tell, there was not a lot of conversation with actual folks who were on the campaign or on the independent expenditure.
Rob, so this is really a deep dive, your piece. I'm not sure exactly how many words, but you go through many of the numerous high points of the 2024 presidential campaign. And in particular, you do talk about the two ads that were perhaps the most debated ads of the cycle. You talk about the Kamala Harris she's with they, them, not you. And you also talk about the clip from The View where she couldn't disagree with Joe Biden on anything. And you come to a different conclusion than the Trump campaign officials who have talked about that ad, in that you say that it was more about not having a total brand than it was any ad being so damaging. But you don't regret that the Harris campaign didn't respond to the they, them ad and said that cultural issues are not as resonant anymore. But with Abigail Spanberger and her success against fighting trans ads, she did release an ad and try to combat the narrative. And she didn't get into the policy, but she said, you know me, and she kept consistently arguing for local. So isn't her success and her win actually partially attributed to the fact that she was willing to respond and engage?
Well, I want to push back on that question a little bit, insofar as we did respond to the trans ad. I think the thing that we found that people were concerned about with that ad was not actually transgender people. They were concerned about this sense that Kamala Harris was focused on the wrong stuff. And so we produced a number of ads that, pushed back directly on the claim. They were less effective in real terms and in focus groups than actually just talking about the economy and showing that Harris cared about the issues that matter to them. And so, you've seen Republicans try to go back to this over and over and over and over again, and it hasn't worked. And in the Spanberger race and in other places. And it's because it's not an issue that people really care about all that much. The reason it was effective to the extent it was effective in 2024 was part of an overall argument that Harris was focused on, the wrong kind of liberal priorities over, the things that people were actually worried about in real time. And I think that's why you've seen Republicans kind of move away from that, and why you've seen even the Trump team push back and say that was the, one of the reasons why Spanberger 1 was actually being focused on that rather than cost of living. And so, in many ways, I think that the strategy we used to push back sort of bore out.
So do you think, Rob, this central problem that you identified, that Democrats didn't have a brand in 2024, has been remedied? Do you think that Democrats have a brand today? Or is there, if not, in what direction would you push them?
Yeah, look, I think there are moves being made in the right direction. At the end of the day, when you are the out party, you have a lot more chance to sort of define yourself by hypotheticals than, the things that are actually happening. But in many ways, I do think, an economic message that is broadly populist, focused on bringing costs down and sort of making the country fairer and more just. I think those are all great places to go. I think Trump is sort of finding himself in the trap of leading into a lot of the stuff that people are mad about. If as I sort of talk about in the piece, I think Democrats very often sort of miss just how disillusioned people are. And when you're the folks who are sort of defending the institution and defending the status quo, it's very easy to find yourself in the position of saying, well, everything's great, or not going far enough. And, there are a lot of people out there who are just really feeling like the institutions of government, the institutions of media, and the institutions of our body politic are not looking out and delivering for them. And I think ultimately that's the big thing is the last part of this is really delivery. I think Democrats may get, another opportunity to govern because of the Republicans falling down on the job. But the question is really going to be, are you able to get things done for people? Are you able to make people's lives materially better? And that's the open question.
Rob, do you believe that Gaza was a factor in why Vice President Kamala Harris lost the election? When you look back and see where the country has shifted just over the last year and a half, and the attitudes that were beginning to come to the surface as a result of college protests and campus protests, the sentiment that people had that she wasn't distancing herself from the Biden administration, specifically Joe Biden's Gaza policy, do you believe that was a factor that cost her the election?
Look, I think Gaza was absolutely a factor, and maybe not in the ways that people would consider it. A polling issue. You would see a lot of numbers that would say, "Oh, well, young people don't actually care about Gaza or anything like that." But it just sort of is. It doesn't really pass the smell test, right? When you feel the environment that was out there, I think it sort of meaningfully reduced enthusiasm in ways that might be difficult to measure. But at the end of the day, you would see this. It was hard to say supportive things about certainly President Biden or Kamala Harris on the internet, because it would become a conversation about their position on Gaza. The protests really drove coverage in a real way. And so, my take is that in ways that may not be picked up in a traditional poll, it became an issue that made it harder to be publicly supportive, which obviously reduced enthusiasm. So can I say to you it was the reason? I don't think it was the reason. There were a lot of reasons, but certainly it was a factor.